a few other sort of points which I think are worth mentioning as other points you might kind of carry around with you in your toolkit of approaches for thinking about economic development that I think come out of the study of the history of economic development. One of them is this idea that once the phase of the Great Divergence began, in a way you can think of there being, this is obviously a simplification, but at any point in time we can kind of think of there being three groups of countries. There are the leaders, the countries that are really at the technological frontier, the countries that are using the most advanced technologies that allow them to have the highest GDP per capita. And during the course we've asked a series of questions about what it takes to be a leader. Why is it, for example, that the United States overtook Britain at the start of the 20th century as the richest country in the world? What were the characteristics of the United States that allowed it to become such a technologically successful nation? Then we've seen that amongst the countries that have benefited from the technological development since the Industrial Revolution, most of them are what we would call followers. They're not the leaders, they're not the country that's had the that's had the highest GDP per capita at a point in time, but rather what they've been able to do is benefit from the technological development that's occurred in and being used in the richest parts of the world. Obviously that's a simplification because even amongst the followers there's going to be examples of technological development which has occurred in those countries. But if we're talking about countries that are beginning, say, from 20 or 30% of the GDP of the United States, then to a large extent what we are talking about is those countries taking the technologies from countries like the United States and the other leaders and by investing in those technologies, increasing economic development, increasing the level of GDP per capita. And we talked about the framework of catch-up. If, for example, there's been some major disruption like World War II, convergence, that's the idea that you're taking the technologies from the most developed parts of the world and incorporating those into your production. And also the idea of structural change, that you're converting your economy from being agricultural to industrial and thereby increasing the productivity of labour. And then we've seen that there are the poor countries which over relatively prolonged periods of time can be observed to fail to make relatively little progress compared to the leaders and the followers. So there's a taxonomy of experiences of different countries in the world at a particular point in time, which really give rise to different questions. So the leaders, we're asking, well, what does it take to be a leading country? The followers, we have this set of factors which we can use to try and understand why it is that they've caught up. Was it catch-up? Was it convergence? Was it structural change? And then there's the poorer countries which aren't making progress, where we have a set of questions about why it is that they are experiencing very little economic development. The second other theme that I want to talk about is the idea that at various points in history we've seen different viewpoints emerge about what the best way to organise economic activity for promoting economic growth is. And in particular in the 20th century we saw this battle of economic systems between the idea of a market-based planned economy and a socialist planning type economy. And a major part of the history of the 20th century was the playing out economically and politically of that battle of economic systems. And if we think about the capitalist market-based economy, then we've seen, really going back to the Industrial Revolution when we talked about the debate between Southey and Macaulay, but then into the 19th century with Marx, and then into the 20th century with Keynes and Hayek, this idea that there's a lot of good things about market-based capitalist economies, but there are some problems as well. And so what we want to do is try and civilise the market economy, in particular to try and reduce business cycle fluctuations and to try and reduce the degree of inequality which comes from capitalist market-based economies. So that's really been another theme of economic development, the idea of different approaches and the idea that we don't necessarily need to take a particular way of organising economic activity as fixed, that there's been human tinkering with those ways of organising economic activity as well. And just a final point, a really important reminder that while I'm talking here about very general themes and issues, that really every country is different, that you've got to look at to understand the development potential or the historical experience of each country. You really need to look at the experience of that country. But I think you can do that with the kind of general toolkit that I've been presenting here. So in the end, you've got to think about countries and regions in terms of their individual characteristics and experiences. But you can approach the task of thinking about those regions or countries with a general toolkit that says, well, look, the fundamental determinants are geography, institutions, culture, and contact with success. Look, if we're thinking about the prospects for a country to grow, then historically, if it's transiting from agriculture to industry, what we're thinking about is the scope for catch-up, the scope for convergence, and the scope for structural change in the economy. Another point, of course, is that when we've looked at big events like the Industrial Revolution, when we've looked at big events like the rise of the US as an industrial power, when we've thought about events like the global financial crisis, when we've thought about the experience of, for example, Africa, that we find there's not just one explanation for their historical experience, that generally there are a variety of explanations. So when we think about the development experience of countries today, if we're going to be faithful to what we've learned from history, we really have to at least begin thinking that it's likely that the causes of the state of development in a particular country we're interested in today are going to be multi-causal. Okay, to finish up this section of the lecture, I want to do something a little bit, still general, but a little bit more applied. I want to say, suppose the World Bank came along to you and said, look, we've got this particular country, it's a poor country today, we want you to advise us on what you think the country's prospects for economic development are. What is it that I think you can take from the historical experience of economic development that we've been studying to make some progress in thinking about that question of what are this particular country's prospects for economic development. And I've grouped what I think historical experience of economic development can tell us about prospects for development in a country today into two categories. Because obviously the starting point for trying to answer that question of what are a country's prospects for economic development is to find out some information about that country. And I think what historical experience does in the first place is it directs us to what are the right questions we want to ask to obtain that information which we're going to use to, if you like, forecast or try and analyse a country's prospects for economic development. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what I think historical experience tells us about the questions we'd want to ask about that country in order to be able to answer the question about what its prospects for economic development are. And so, first of all, I've started here just with the three questions that really reflect our fundamental determinants. So if we really believe that those are the fundamental determinants of economic development, geography, institutions, culture, contact with global economic leaders, then if we want to understand a particular country's prospects for economic development, one of the things we need to do is understand those features of the country we're interested in. We need to understand what is the country's geography, what's its natural resources, what's its climate, what's the soil quality, How easy is internal transport? How easy is port access? How often do natural disasters strike this country? What's the disease environment? Those are all questions that we'd want to ask about the country's geography to understand its prospects for development. Then we want to ask about what are its institutions and culture. And for example, if I was doing that and using the framework that I've talked about in this section of the lecture, I'd be doing that by thinking in terms of, well, what is the scope for this country to be implementing policies that are going to reflect the public interest. And as I said, I would think of that in terms of two dimensions. First of all, does this country have a state or government which has the capacity to implement policies that are going to influence behaviour, influence economic activity? And secondly, I'd ask, are the institutions in this country such that government and the state are going to be directed to be making policies that are in the interest of the general population? Or do the institutions allow the government or state to act in the private interest of the rulers? So that's the type of question I'd be asking, or the type of evaluation I'd be making of institutions in the particular country that you're interested in studying. And then we've talked right back in the first lecture about the idea that contact with the global economic leaders matters, that it means you're more likely to have trading relations, that mean you're more likely to get access to new technologies, you're more likely to get capital flows from those countries. So you'd be wanting to assess what the relationship, the international relationships that this country has with the global economic leaders. A couple other examples of questions: demography. In the short run, which might be the period that you're interested in, we know that countries can get a boost to their GDP per capita, for example, by having a relatively large proportion of the population who are of a workforce age. Or it may be that the demographic composition, as I'll mention just later on, is important for thinking about the extent to which the country is going to be able to save to finance investing in new capital. So understanding something about the demographic composition of the population is going to be another important influence on understanding economic development. Of course, you want to understand about the country's current stage of development. You want to understand about the sectoral composition of output, and the reason for that is that where the country is today is obviously going to influence what the logical course of development is going to be. And so understanding where it is today provides the basis for thinking about the likelihood of being able to move to having a more developed economy. Or the current stage of development is going to tell you about what path of development this country might be most likely to follow. Has it recently experienced major disruption? So understanding about factors like wars or civil wars, that's going to tell you something about the scope to grow through catch-up, for example. And as I've mentioned, under current stage of development, what's likely to be the path to development? Do you need to think about this country as a country that's going to grow through industrialisation, mainly selling to local population? Is it going to develop through industrialisation by exporting? Is it a country that's rich in natural resources and then potentially can develop by exporting raw materials to industrialised parts of the world? And that matters because depending on what path you think the country is going to follow to development, you're going to have to worry about different aspects of policies or institutions being important in influencing development. I'm going to assume that we're thinking of a country that's going to develop via capital accumulation. So for example, it might be a country that's still predominantly agricultural, but where we think that the likely path to development is going to be via industrialising. The second way then in which I think a historical perspective on economic development can help us to understand the development prospects in a particular country is by then asking, well, what does historical experience tell us are the factors that are likely to determine whether a country can successfully develop via capital accumulation and industrialisation. So historical experience, first of all, gives us a set of questions. It informs us about what information we would need to decide whether what this country's development prospects are. Then what it does is it really lets us evaluate, or gives us a framework for evaluating the prospects for development in terms of a particular development path that we think a country might follow. So if we're thinking about development via capital accumulation, then what issues are going to be important in evaluating whether it's likely to be developed successfully through capital accumulation or not? And I think historical experience tells us that there's several questions. First of all, will the capital work? So one of the issues we talked about with geography in poor countries was the idea that some Western technologies, for example, agricultural technologies developed for temperate climates, or disease technologies really developed for Western diseases. And so it may be the case that there's Western technologies which it's just not practical to think of applying in the particular poor region of the world that we're interested in. So one thing that historical experience teaches us is that not all capital is transferable. It may be. If we're talking about a poor region in Western Europe and a poor region in Eastern Europe, then the technology may be perfectly transferable. But we need to ask the question, what is the scope for this country to grow through capital accumulation, because not all technologies may be transferable from the rich to poor parts of the world. Secondly, we have to ask, are there incentives to introduce new capital? So this is an idea that's recurred at several points in the course as well. The idea that, for example, in the Industrial Revolution, we saw the idea that Britain arguably, this is the thesis of Robert Allen, had a strong incentive to be introducing new capital, substituting for labour, because the price of labour was really expensive. And so the thing that meant that Britain got this first mover advantage through the Industrial Revolution, because it was really only in Britain that it was economically feasible or profitable to introduce new capital to replace labour, because it was there that labour was relatively expensive. And so we've got to ask, okay, in this region of the world, is it actually going to be profitable to introduce particular technologies? Is the cost of labour such that you can make money by using this capital to replace labour? And so that's another question about the scope for growing through capital accumulation, that we'd only expect it to be feasible for a country to be using capital from the rich world if, for example, a cost of labour, cost of energy are such that it's going to be profitable to introduce those new technologies. Then there has to be knowledge of the new capital. In the country we're interested in, there has to be, for example, entrepreneurs, scientists who are going to know about that capital and know how to bring it to the country and build it into the production processes in that country. Two other questions which are really important are, okay, suppose you've identified that there is capital in the rich world which would work, which could be potentially profitable based on the prices of labour, energy, and that you know about it, then you've got to buy it. So can investment in the new capital be paid for? That's one really important question that history tells us is important for developing via capital accumulation. That the countries in the world that have developed through convergence, they're countries that have been able to pay for importing capital equipment for the rest of the world. So in order to understand whether a particular country that the World Bank had sent you off to study could actually grow via capital accumulation, you'd have to understand whether that country could pay for the capital investment. And once it's paid for, then there has to be the idea that you can actually make money from it. So the only reason someone's going to put up the money for that capital equipment is if they think they can make money from it. So the second question is, can entrepreneurs earn a profit from the new capital? And so I think that history tells us something about each of those last two questions as well. History, first of all, tells us that those two questions are important, but it tells something about how we'd want to go about answering them. So paying for new capital. We know that different countries have paid for their investment in capital in different ways. They've paid out of domestic savings, they've paid out of international borrowing, and they've paid out of foreign aid. And here are some examples of the determinants of factors that might influence whether countries can pay for the new capital. The demography, so the extent to which you have a large working age population, or a large proportion of your population is working age, the dependency ratio in the population, that's going to be one of the determinants of the extent to which a country has domestic savings that it can draw on to finance investment in capital. Productivity in agriculture. So we've talked at a few points about how if you're going to industrialise, then what you're essentially doing is you're taking workers out of agriculture into industry, and you need some of the output from agriculture to finance buying these imports of capital equipment. So you really need an economy where the productivity of agriculture is high or increasing if you want to be able to finance investment in new capital through domestic savings. The development of capital markets, that may be important for domestic savings, but it's also going to influence the extent to which you're likely to be able to borrow internationally to finance this capital. Openness to international trade, of course, is also going to influence the extent to which you can borrow internationally, and may be a factor as well through influencing your relationships with other countries that affects your likelihood of receiving foreign aid. There's other factors we could talk about there, but I'm just giving some examples of the factors that history tells us have been important in determining whether countries have been able to pay for new technologies. Essentially what's happening is if you're a poor country, you don't have this technology, you've got to buy it from the rest of the world. How are you going to pay for it? Okay, one way is through domestic savings. That depends on productivity in agriculture and demography. If you can't pay for it that way, then you've got to pay for it through international borrowing or foreign aid. And that's likely to depend on being open to international trade, the extent of development of capital markets. Okay, last thing. The other question that I said history tells us is important for thinking about whether a country can grow via capital accumulation is whether you're going to earn a profit from the new capital. And I think there's a variety of influences that are important there. First of all, you need to have a workforce who are going to use the capital equipment. So you need to have an economy that's sufficiently flexible that you can achieve the structural change of shifting workers from agriculture to industry. You also need the capacity to be training the workers who are shifting from agriculture to industry, or at least new workers who are going to be the workers in industry who might otherwise have gone into agriculture, in the skills that they need to be able to operate the new capital. You need labour market institutions and regulation that mean that all of the returns from investment in new capital aren't going to be expropriated through hold-up by workers. On the other hand, you need labour market institutions and regulations and more generally government welfare systems, for example, that mean that workers feel that they are going to be fairly treated if they're willing to accept lower wages than they might have argued for. And so this, for example, this idea of labour market institutions regulation being really important was Barry Eichengreen's point about Europe being able to Western Europe being able to successfully develop after World War II. They had the right labour market institutions to ensure that workers received a fair share, but also entrepreneurs could be sure that they were going to receive a profit sufficient to repay the investment they'd made. Earning a profit from new capital can depend on openness to international trade. If you're not open to international trade, then the only way you're going to be able to sell your output is on local markets. If you are open to international trade, if the government's providing you with incentives to trade internationally, then that's going to give you a larger market, and that may be something that adds to the belief that you're likely to earn a profit that's going to mean that you can pay back the investment that you've made. And so when we look, for example, at say the high-performing Asian economies, we've talked about the importance of their openness to international trade, the importance with China, its openness to international trade in explaining its returns on investment from new capital. And of course you need security of property rights. You need the entrepreneur who invests in the new capital to think that they are not going to have that return expropriated by having their business taken over by the government, or having someone be able to just come in and arbitrarily take over their business. So this is several factors, examples that we learn from history are important in whether you're going to earn a profit from new capital. So in this section of the lecture, I've tried to give an overview of what I think are some of the really big issues and themes. As I emphasised, when we come to think about the development experience, the development prospects of a particular country, you've got to do it in terms of that country. But I do think that history gives us this toolkit of general skills and approaches which we can bring to thinking about that individual country. And I've tried to illustrate that in this last part of this section of the lecture by saying, okay, suppose the World Bank came to you and said, what's the development prospects of this country? What I've tried to say is, well, look, if you were to take the general themes and ideas that I talked about in the first part of this section, it gives us a set of questions we'd want to ask about that country. And secondly, once we know the path of development that we think it's going to follow, it gives us a way of evaluating whether we think it's likely that that country is going to be successful. As I said at the start of this section of the lecture, I really encourage you as well to do your own thinking about what the big themes and issues have been, to create your own toolkit from historical experience to try and to have available to you for trying to understand economic development today.